Good evening, everyone. We're kicking off a new series tonight, Women in Science, from Pioneers to the Present. Tree rings reveal Earth's past. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Valerie Trouet.
Thank you. Woo. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's really my pleasure. So as Shipard said, when I applied for an NSF grant, which is now coming towards an end, it's ending in 2019, I suggested to NSF to include an outreach component, a Science Cafe series that highlights the great efforts and achievements of some really great women scientists here at the U of A, because I don't think they are being highlighted enough. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of my talk, but I really want to, the rest of my talk, I want to focus on my own tree ring research, but I will start with highlighting the work of Florence Holly Ellis, who is the first female dendrochronologist, so the first tree ring scientist. She got her master's in 1928, master's in anthropology here at U of A, and then took the inaugural tree ring lecture from Andrew Douglas in 1930. So Andrew Douglas is a guy who invented tree ring research, basically, here at the U of A, and he established a tree ring lab in 1937. But so Florence Holly was one of the few students who was in his first class in dendrochronology that he ever taught at the U of A in 1930. She then went on to get a PhD from the University of Chicago in 1934. Her work, so in archaeology, she worked on Chetro Kettle in Chaco Canyon, archaeology of that site. And then what really makes her a science pioneer is that she took what she learned at the U of A in terms of tree ring research that at that point in time was really focused on the American Southwest. She took it and started applying it in the Midwest. So she moved it east of the Mississippi. So before I talk about what a monumental achievement that was, I should probably, for those of you who are not aware, introduce you to the concept of tree ring research and tree ring analysis. So what we do is we don't kill trees. We take cores with a hollow core, it's like a biopsy from a tree, and then we look at the rings in a tree. So if you have a 100-year-old tree, I think most of you have probably looked at the ring, counted the rings in trees when they were kids. If you have a 100-year-old tree, it has 100 rings in it. Now we can do more than just counting those rings. We can actually, what we do is we measure the width of the rings, so that's what's shown here. So if you have a living tree, you take a core out of it. I've got to be careful what I do here. You take a core out of it, and you can see the rings. And the width of each ring, so a tree forms a ring every year, and how much it grows per year, or the width of the ring in every year, is a function of the climate, is influenced by the climate under which the trees grow. So for instance, here in the Southwest, if it's a very dry year, the trees are not going to be very happy, and you get a very narrow ring. If it's a very wet year, the trees like to have a lot of water, and you're going to get a wide ring. And because all the trees in the same area are influenced by the same climate, they're going to show the same sequence of narrow and wide rings. It's like a barcode. So you can start comparing the barcodes of different trees, and they will line up. So if you have two living trees from the same area, their barcodes will be very similar. Now what that allows us to do is then to also look at the barcodes in wood. We're not limited to living trees. We can take a piece of wood, even if we don't know how old it is, and try it, fit it to that known pattern of wide and narrow rings. And if you find a good match, then you know the date of when that wood was cut. So that's how archaeological tree ring dating works. That's how we can go further back in time. So you have the tree ring width in the living tree. This is a tree ring width series from a historical building. If the patterns match, you can date when that log in the building was built, and so forth. You can go further back in time that way. So the longest continuous tree ring chronology that's been developed in that way, combining living trees with archaeological material, with historical buildings, with trees from dead wood as well, is 12,000 years long. It's from Europe. We have a continuous record of which years were wet and which years were dry, or which rings were wide and which rings were narrow for the last 12,000 years for Europe. As I mentioned, tree ring research originated here at the U of A. That's why we have the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. And it's a really good place to do tree ring research, because we're in the Southwest. The trees are very sensitive to drought. They all show very similar patterns, and it's relatively easy compared to other regions. So to get back to Florence Holly, what she aimed to do was to date the mound building culture in the Midwest. So Mississippian culture at that point in time in the 1930s, they weren't sure when the culture developed. Her aim was to take wood from the mounds and to try and date that. But at that point, there wasn't any living tree chronology at all yet in the eastern U.S. or east of the Mississippi, so she had a lot of work ahead of her. And doing that, she ran into quite a few issues, and that's why she really was a pioneer, things that were new at that time. She didn't have a lot of the benefits that dendrochronologists working in the Southwest had. So this is, I had to put some photos of tree rings in here. So if you look through a microscope at a pine tree, this is what you see. And so when we talk about tree rings, this is, everyone here, I think, can see which one is a tree ring and which one is not. So that's the growth direction. And pine trees form very clear rings. They're fairly straightforward wood anatomy. Now, there was a few amongst her, the burial mounds that Howley looked at, there were a few pine trees, but most of the trees she looked at were either oaks or cedar trees, so junipers, which, as you can tell, so again, this is the growth direction, and oak they're both deciduous trees, broadleaf trees. The ring structure is very different, and when the rings get narrow, these are much harder to detect than a simple pine tree. So even there, just working with different species, remember this is in the 30s, even just working with different species was a challenge at that point. Another challenge that she had to face is hopefully not loud motorcycles when she was giving presentations. But like, this is the map. So where tree ring research was being done before is in the Four Corners region. What she aimed to do was look at the Mississippian culture, which was a much, much wider region. So we're not talking about one climatic region. We're talking a very broad region with many climatic factors. So in addition to more difficult species, a new region, a wider region, there was also the issue that it was hard to find old trees east of the Mississippi, because even in the early 1900s, everything had been clear-cut. So there was not much old wood to work with to build that living tree chronology. And then in terms of archaeological wood, there were some issues as well, because it's wetter in the east, so the wood doesn't preserve very well. So there was, no pun intended, amount of difficulties that she had to overcome to develop tree ring research east of the Mississippi. Another aspect, so she worked east of the Mississippi from around 1934 till around 1943. Depression era, so funding is hard now, but funding back then definitely was another issue that she had to deal with. And in the early 40s, and that's the reason why she stopped, World War II was going on. So there's an interesting anecdote that talks about one of her assistants who was quarrying trees in the field, I think somewhere in western Kentucky. And there were some landowners around where he was quarrying who got suspicious of what this was in 1940, what this guy with this strange instrument that they'd never seen before was doing on their land. So they stopped him, they asked to search his car, and then in his car they found a German book. So this was an assistant of hers who had a German textbook to read about, learn about dendrochronology. And so he was accused of being a spy for the Nazis, of implementing bombs and all of this, and he only just got away by convincing them to talk to someone that he collaborated with, a local person. But so these are some of the challenges that they had to deal with. One last challenge that Florence Holly had to deal with, and I'll leave this quote up for a second. So one instance that happened is that one of her assistants that she had trained, only 2 years in, staged a coup. So this guy Lassiter decided that he would be a better dendrochronologist than this woman who is supposed to be his boss. So he convinced her bosses to give him her position, and he basically kicked her out. And so when that came to light, he tried to hire another dendrochronologist, Stallings, and this is what he wrote in a letter to Stallings. So basically saying, we need a man for this job, and please don't tell anyone that I said so, because, it would hurt her feelings if anyone found out that I said so. So this now happened about over 80 years ago, but to be honest, I'm pretty sure that somewhere there's a letter or an email along those lines about me as well. This is something that is not something from 80 years ago, right? This is the kind of everyday sexism that women in science need to face. I'll leave it at that, because now I'm going to talk about my own research. Okay, I'm sorry if this is a little bit skewed. So I'm a tree ring scientist. I primarily use tree rings to study the climate of the past, and I'm very passionate about that subject. And tree rings are very good at studying the climate of the past. And there's two important reasons why I think they're a very interesting tool to look at past climate. One, the timescales that we look at when we look at past climate through tree rings is mostly the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. Like, we're kind of limited in time in how far back we can go. We're not like ice cores that can look at climate 800,000 years ago. We don't have that long of a record. But those last 1,000 to 2,000 years, for us humans, are super interesting, right? Because that's when, a lot of our civilization evolved. That's when we have a lot of written history records that we can compare our scientific results to. The other benefit of tree ring data is that we can look at climate extremes, at extreme events that have happened in the past. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'll give 3 examples of climate extremes that we looked at using tree rings. And why is that important? It's important to look at climate extremes in the past because they are rare, right? They are extreme, so they are rare. If you only look at instrumental data from the 20th century, you're not going to have a lot of extremes because they wouldn't be extremes if they happened a lot, right? They're rare per definition. So by looking further in the past, it gives us a longer record to look at how probable it is that these extremes occur. And that's important because it's the climatic extremes that influence our day-to-day lives most. I think that'll become very clear in my first example, which is not a coincidence. So the first example I want to talk about is hurricanes. How do we use tree rings to reconstruct hurricane activity in the past? So what's in the name? Oh, it's cut off here, but this is Florence, another connection to Florence Holly. That's all right. It's I think everyone is aware that Florence happened just a few days ago. Very big hurricane. Thank you very much. On the mid-Atlantic coast. And I want to talk about a study that we did just a couple of years ago. where we use tree rings, thank you, from the Florida Keys to look at hurricane activity in the Florida Keys. So what happens when a hurricane hits a forest, or really any bigger tropical storm hits a forest? It's going to damage the trees, right? It's going to break off big branches. It's going to topple over trees. It's going to blow the leaves off of trees and so forth. And this gets recorded again in the ring widths. Like if a tree doesn't have leaves, if it loses big branches, that's going to influence its growth for that year and for the following year. Because if it doesn't have leaves or needles, it can't photosynthesize and it can't grow. So this is work in collaboration with my colleague Grant Harley, who's now at the University of Idaho. He went to the Florida Keys. I didn't have the privilege of doing fieldwork there, but he went to the Florida Keys. He collected about 40 samples from about 40 trees. And this is a kind of effect that big storms have on tree rings. So they reduce the ring width for a number of years, for 3 to 4 years, as long as that effect of these branches that have been blown off lasts. This is a map of where the Florida Keys are, in case you're wondering whether this is a good place to study tropical storms. The white lines that you see are the storm tracks of all the storms that have hit within a radius of 100 kilometers of the Florida Keys, I think over the last 50 years. So, you know, there is storm activity there. If you have 40 trees with this kind of record, and you record for each tree when these growth suppressions happen, you can create a time series of growth suppressions. So Grant's trees are about 300 years old, so he's now has a record that goes to 1700 up to the present that records which are the years when tree growth was suppressed. You can compare that record to the instrumental record of when hurricanes or big storms hit the Florida Keys, and then you can compare the two over the 20th century. I'm quickly gonna simplify and explain this graph. So on the horizontal axis are years, with the year 0 being a storm year, the year 1 being the year after a storm year, and then up to 5 years after a storm year. The vertical axis shows the percentage of trees that show suppressed growth in each of these years. Black means that it's statistically significant. So what this shows is that in storm years and the years following storms, we get more than average trees that show this suppressed growth. So this basically tells us that suppressed growth is years when many trees show suppressed growth is an indicator of hurricanes in the past. Now this record that I showed earlier goes back to 1700, but we were ambitious and we wanted to go further back in time, like 300 years. We want 500 years. And so when Grant and I were talking about it, it happened actually when we were organizing a conference here in Tucson. And I remember very clearly when the idea came about for this study. We were on it was one of the last nights of the conference, and we were on the patio of Hotel Congress sharing a beer. So Grant and I, and then the third person who joined our conversation was Marta Dominguez del Mas, who's a dendroarchaeologist from Spain. And so she uses tree rings to date archaeological material, and she specializes in shipwrecks. So she has one of the coolest jobs that I can think of. Her job is to dive for shipwrecks, sample the wood from these, ancient shipwrecks, and then use tree ring dating to date when those ships were built. And so she joined our conversation about hurricanes in Florida, and then she said, why don't we look at shipwrecks? Why don't we look at, ships wrecked because of storms? Why don't we do something with shipwrecks? And so Marta is Spanish, and so indeed, if we wanted to go further back in time, shipwrecks would be one way to do it. So the Spanish were the first to do the transatlantic voyage from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas. And they started around, 1492, obviously, Christopher Columbus, and went on about until the late 1800s. They kept very well track of how many ships they sent, which ships they sent, how many came back, which ones wrecked when and where and why, so that, because this to them was a huge investment, both to build those ships and send them across, and then this was their hegemony. This is how they got gold back to Europe, right? So this is why Spain was such a big political force. So there's a very good documentary record of how many ships wrecked every year, where they wrecked, when they wrecked, why they wrecked. So we dug into that record and we developed a time series of the number of shipwrecks per year in the Caribbean region. This is that time series. And now, so this goes from 1495 to the early 1800s. And this overlaps with our tree ring record. So I'm going to show a lot of time series. I'm sorry, the present is always going to be on the right. So if you remember, our tree ring record of hurricanes goes back to 1700. Shipwreck record goes to 1825. And I'm going to show you a graph that's going to hopefully look familiar. Because this is what happens when you now compare the shipwrecks to the tree rings. So your year zero now is now not a storm year. It's now a year when most ships wrecked. And the bars show how many trees were suppressed in the years with the most shipwrecks. And you see the exact same patterns as when you compare the tree suppressions to the storms. So if you think of it, there really only is one reason why many shipwrecks would cause many trees to be suppressed in the Florida Keys. There's really only one joint factor between the two, and that's tropical storms. So this shows us that we can use the shipwreck record as a proxy, as an indication of how many storms happened in the past as well. This is now our time series present on the right. In black is the number of shipwrecks, and red is the number of suppressed trees. So from 1495 to the present. There's one period that stands out. When I looked at these data, and I'm a paleoclimatologist, I study the climate of the past, I know my periods, no pun intended. There is this one period from 1645 till 1715 where there was a lot less shipwrecks and thus assumed tropical storms than before and after. And that period from 1645 till 1715, as a paleoclimatologist, immediately rings a bell, because that's the Maunder minimum. The Maunder minimum is a period when we know that the sun was much less active, so the sun doesn't always send out an equal amount of energy to the Earth. There is fluctuations in that. And one of the best known fluctuations is that Maunder minimum. So we know that there was less energy coming from the sun to the Earth, which resulted in generally cooler temperatures on Earth. So a good example of that, of those generally cooler temperatures, is that, for instance, the River Thames in London froze over in winter. And so they would have winter fairs on the river throughout the Maunder minimum. We know that from paintings from that period of time. So what we found is that during that Maunder minimum, this is now an index of the amount of energy that the sun sent to the Earth over time. So you see how little energy was sent during the Maunder minimum. Corresponds exactly to less tropical cyclones during that period. And the link that we think, so this is hypothetical, the link between the two, we think, so with cooler temperatures also come cooler sea surface temperatures. And we know that hurricanes are a function of how warm the ocean temperature is. So that's the reason why hurricane season is in September from August till November. In winter, it's just the water is too cold for hurricanes really to happen. So that's our hurricane story. The second story I want to talk about is a little shorter and probably a little more straightforward. So this study we were working on it from 2013 till 2016. One of these years in 2015, the big story was the California drought. So I don't know if you remember, in 2015, on April 1st, in California, so this is the snowpack over the Sierra Nevada. In April 1st, 2015, the numbers were announced for what the condition of the snowpack was in the Sierra Nevada. So we're moving to the West Coast now. And the number in 2015 was 5% of average. So not 5% of the max, but 5% of what the average condition is of the snowpack in California. To give you an idea, so this is what the snowpack looked like from a satellite image in 2015. This is what it looks like in an average year. This is in 2010. So even just visually, you can see the reduction in snowpack. And this for California is huge because they don't get water. They're not like Tucson. They don't get water in the summer. They don't get a monsoon. So the only water they can rely on is that snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, because snow is what stores the water for use in summer when it melts off. So if you don't have a snowpack, you're in trouble for the entire year until the next winter happens. So when April 1st came about, the headline, this made the news, and the headline said a 2015 Sierra Nevada snowpack, so SWE is a metric for snowpack, is the lowest in 80 years. So they've been measuring snowpack in the Sierra Nevada for the last 80 years. And so the headline said lowest in 80 years. And when we saw, my group and I saw that headline, so I should say this is work primarily by my two postdocs, Sumaya Belmeshri and Florine Baps, postdocs at the time. They've both moved on by now. We realized we can do better than that. We have tree rings. 80 years is nothing. Let's see what we can do. So what we did is we used existing tree ring data from the Central Valley in California, and they're blue oak trees that are very, very sensitive, I'll show it in a second, very sensitive to drought. And so the idea is that by we didn't use trees from the Sierra Nevada, we used trees from the Central Valley, but basically all water, all precipitation that reaches California comes from the Pacific Ocean. And so as it's the same storms that first bring rainfall to the Central Valley and then move further eastwards and bring snowfall to the Sierra Nevada. So if you don't have storms over the Pacific, you're going to get dry years both in the Central Valley and in the Sierra Nevada. So we use these tree rings from the Central Valley to look at snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. This is one of those blue oaks, beautiful trees, some of the most drought-sensitive trees I've ever worked with. So we used a network of trees from all around the Central Valley. We compared it to, similar to the hurricane story. So we have 500 years of tree rings. We compared it with the instrumental data over the 20th century with that 80 years of instrumental data to make sure that our tree rings are reliable recorders of snowfall. We found a relationship that's reliable between the two, and I used the tree rings to reconstruct snowpack over the entire 500 years. That allowed us to adjust that headline. So what we found is 2015 was the lowest snowpack, not just in the last 80 years, but it was unprecedented in the tree ring record. So it was the lowest snowpack over the last 500 years. As far as we can go back, there was not a year that had less snow than 2015. If you're curious, I just looked it up. 2018, we're doing much better. We're at 92% of average. On April 1st, we were at 92% of average of snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. So I saw some faces going like, huh, what? And that's also the reaction that we got from the press. So this was a great experience for Sumaya and for everyone involved. So the April 1st snowpack data came out on April 1st. We saw it maybe on April 10th, decided we can work with this, we can do something with this. We used existing tree ring data, and I had two incredibly smart and efficient postdocs, and we cranked out a paper, and it was published by September 15th of the same year, so 4 months later. And then at that point, the California drought was really very fresh in everyone's mind. And so our work got picked up by a lot of news outlets, including the New York Times. I don't have a copy with me, but it was actually very interesting. So I'm showing this slide not just to show you that our work is relevant, also to people outside of the tree-ring world, but also because of this little related content headline, which if you click on it links to another study that shows that. So our study finds that snowpack is the lowest in 500 years. At the same time, there was another article that wrote about 3 major California wildfires remain largely out of control. Obviously, drought leads to wildfires. We've been seeing that in California in recent years. And so this leads me to the third type of extreme event that we can study using tree rings. So we've looked at hurricanes, we've looked at drought. We can also look at wildfires. And so the third and last study I want to talk about is a network of fire history, so tree-ring-based fire history sites, and I'll show you in a second how that works, that we developed when I was a postdoc at Penn State. And so we have 30 sites throughout the Sierra Nevada, all the way from, actually beyond the Sierra Nevada, from Lassen National Park all the way down to Sequoia Kings Canyon. So 2,000 samples, more than 20,000 fire scars to look at fire history. The way that works, I don't know if anyone has ever seen a cat face. This is what we call a cat face. And basically, if we're talking about low intensity fires, so ground fires, not the big destructive fires that kill trees, because if that happens, then there's not much wood left for us to work with. But these are fires that hurt the trees, they wound the trees, but they don't necessarily kill the trees. And so when a tree is wounded, trees don't have a way of healing a wound. The best thing they can do is kind of grow over it the next year, so grow their rings over it. So when a fire wounds a tree, the tree's going to start growing over it, but then if a couple of years later another fire hits, that wound's going to be the most sensitive part of the tree, and it's going to get ripped open again, basically, by the next fire. So these cat faces, I don't know if you can see it, but these are like maybe 20, 25 times that the tree's trying to grow over its previous wound and then failing because another fire hit. If you take a slab through this cat face, you get this kind of sample that you see on the right. So you take a slab, you sand it, you bring it to the lab, and these are the fire scars when you look at them on the transversal side. So you can really very clearly see what years this particular tree was wounded by a fire. And then by using tree ring dating, cross dating, you can actually date when this tree grew, and you can date when these fires happened. So we had about 2,000 samples from throughout the Sierra Nevada, 20,000 fire scars like this, that we all compiled in one big Sierra Nevada data set. This is that data set. It goes from 1490 till 1900. So this is the number of sites. This is an index. Don't pay too much attention to what this exactly means, but it does show which ones are the years when fire was burning everywhere in the Sierra Nevada. So this year is 1829, huge fire year. I think about 25 of the 29 sites that we looked at from Lassen all the way down to Sequoia Kings Canyon were all burning in that year. All showed fire scars in the same year. Interestingly enough, the index only goes to about 1900, because after 1900, the fire management changed dramatically in California, throughout the western US. National parks were established by Roosevelt in 1907, and all of a sudden there was a fire suppression regime going on. And it's very difficult to find fire scars in the 20th century anywhere. So we cut our record off in 1900. So what we did then, we wanted to see how this fire record was influenced by climate. So we compared this fire record to drought reconstructions from the region. And what we found was, ta-da, this is a correlation map which shows after 2,000 samples, 2 years of work, that when it's dry in California, it burns. The big fire years in California happen when it's dry. Now that wasn't exactly the, punchline that we were hoping for. We knew that before we started, that when it's dry, it's gonna burn. We know that, right? So we started digging a little deeper and continued to look at our fire history record. And so instead of looking at pure correlations with climate, one thing we noticed is that there are these shifts in the fire regime. So the first one happens around 1776. Before that period, the fire record was pretty continuous, synchronous, or very similar throughout the period before 1776. And then after 1776, you get more synchronous fires and bigger fires. So between 1776 and 1865, you get this period with these big synchronous fires when a large area of the Sierra Nevada was burning all at once. That period ends after 1865, and you go back to a regime that's similar to what it was before 1776. And then after 1904, it just drops off. The fire regime really gets much less than it was before. So this is the interactive part of this talk. And we'll start with the most recent shift. Any idea? So we figured out it's not climate. These shifts are not caused by climate. We looked at various climatic indicators. None of them show shifts around the same time. So it's not climate. Any ideas what it might be? Smokey the Bear. All right, you win a prize. Because indeed, so 1904, as I mentioned before, 1907, so around that time is when Roosevelt established the Forest Service, and after that we started putting out fires throughout the American West, and we were very, very effective at it, as you can see from that graph. The previous, 1865, California. Any ideas what might cause a shift in the fire regime? People who have seen this talk before are not allowed to answer. Yeah. Gonna have to speak up. I still don't hear. That happened a little earlier. Yep. The gold rush, exactly, the 49ers. So around 1849, the gold was discovered in California. Huge influx of European settlers, so in that sense you're right, who brought with them cattle because they needed to be fed. Cattle grazes the landscape, so eliminates grass and eliminates fuel, and it really changes the fire regime. Apart from that, trees were cut all over the place because they needed wood to build the mines and so forth. So you really get a change in forest management that results in a change in fire management. I think the first one is at least took us the longest to figure out what it was. 1776, California. Not unlike what was said before. Yes, I heard it somewhere. So the establishment of the missions on the California coast started in 1769. So really broad-scale European influx. So again, European settlement on the coast. But what happened is that the Native American population, or the indigenous population that lived in California before that, including in the Sierra Nevada, had no resistance to the diseases that the missionaries brought with them. And so there was a very large scale, very destructive depopulation of the native population. So it's estimated that between 80 and 85% of the native population died in this period between 1769 and 1850. And so why that causes a change in fire regime is that the indigenous population they used fire to hunt, to clear the land, to make the land more fertile, including in the Sierra Nevada. But they would not create huge widespread fires. They would create small fires, and so they would create a landscape that was not homogeneous, that would create basically fire barriers. What we do now to prevent fires from spreading, that's what they were doing, and creating a mosaic-like landscape. And so you did get fires, but you didn't get these huge, very big fires. If you take away the indigenous population from the landscape, or a vast majority of it, all of a sudden people are no longer an important driver of fire, but the climate becomes really pretty much the only driver of fire. And so because climate now, as we've seen before, drought is a very important driver of fire. Whenever it's these dry years, all of these sites burn at the same time. So you get very synchronous fire because there's really only one driver of fires during that period between 1777 and 1865, and it's climate, it's drought. So that is the end of the talk. I want to thank my collaborators as well as my postdocs and my PhD students who've been very patient with me over the last couple of years while I was working on this. I would also like to say two things. One reason why my PhD students and postdocs are patient with me is because I'm writing a book about all of this, a popular science book. It will be published in about a year from now. Should be widely available. So you are the exact intended audience for this book, people who are scientifically curious. It's about tree rings and climate history and human history. So if you enjoyed this, then I hope you'll enjoy my book. Second thing I want to say is that this is the first talk of our Fall Science Cafe series, which highlights women in science, on October 18th. A month from now, a Tuesday, right here at Magpies, Jen McIntosh, who's here in the audience, who is a professor in hydrology and atmospheric sciences. She will be talking about fracking and what we know about fracking, scientifically speaking, how it influences water quality and quantity. So thank you very much for coming and for your attention.